Okay, friends, hi. We're going to begin with Esoteric Astrology Adventure number 100. I tried to do that a little earlier, but was stopped by some technical issues. So we'll do my best at this time to continue. We're on page 341 of the Cancerian chapter. We're talking about the interpretation of the moon and Neptune, the development of form, and of the sensitive psychic nature. And the Tibetan begins by saying that these are important developments for the soul who is chosen to incarnate, even though in a way they represent the more irrational part of the human equipment because it is sub-mental. The building of adequate forms, that's under the influence of the moon, and the use and control of the form under the influence of the moon, both are essential if there is to be wise and right cooperation with the plan of God, because through the expression of archetypally conceived forms, the redemption of lower matter proceeds. The form is the medium of redemption because it holds relationships stable in a certain configuration for long enough for salutary impacts to be received by the units of life that are held in the form. Jupiter guarantees this in Cancer. I think this is, it is a lunar factor, but also the fact that Jupiter is exalted in Cancer guarantees this. Jupiter exalted in Cancer is the guarantee. Guarantees this from the very initial stage of birth. The adequate forms, the control of forms, the correct and good forms. Love as relationship to divinity and wisdom as relationship to form lies behind the soul's intent. And in this case, we find, interestingly enough, we find Jupiter as the planet of wisdom in this case. And Neptune, the other exalted planet in Cancer, wisdom is related to the first ray aspect. Zeus, as the thrower of thunderbolts, has some of the first ray in his nature. It may be sort of a seventh ray, first ray monad for Jupiter. We cannot be sure yet. So far it is largely expressing both love and wisdom. But when we find Jupiter in relation to Pisces, we do talk about pervasive wisdom. And love is definitely the quality of the second ray monadic Neptune. In space and time, which are conditions of illusion, of course, for long aeons, the form controls and hides the soul. This is a connection to Cancer and Virgo, and even in Jupiter, with the influence of Jupiter, the soul is engulfed at first, overwhelmed by its container. Jupiter is like the whale, and Jupiter rules such animals of great size. Jupiter swallows the soul, the whale, which is in this case the personality, swallows the soul, the elemental life, the lower forms of life. So in space and time, for long eon, form controls and hides the soul, and this is equally true in regard to the fluid psychic nature, because the fluid psychic nature is not really spirituality, at least with early psychism. It does control and hide the soul. So many psychics seem to think that they are spiritual because of their psychic abilities. But this is not really the case. So these, the form aspect and the psychic nature, it's usually the moon and Neptune respectively, or Jupiter related to the moon and Neptune. You notice how in the glyph of Jupiter, the moon is included, interestingly enough. So let's just call it here, Jupiter and the moon. These, the form and the psychic nature, and I think I'll bring this into a place where it's just a little bit, reveal an eventual concrete perfection in Capricorn, even in the dense physical planes. This is the sign of greatest crystallization, just as it gives entrance into the light sublime, and all concretion is really made of light. It is, all concretion is concretized light, all concrete form. These, the form aspect and the psychic nature, Jupiter and the moon, reach an eventual concrete perfection in Capricorn. In this respect, we find the beauty of Venus operative in Capricorn. Not simply the light sublime upon the mountaintop, but the beauty of the soul's design within matter. So they reach an eventual concrete perfection in Capricorn, interestingly, the psychic nature as well, because even though Jupiter and Neptune fall, and especially Neptune in the case of the psychic nature, fall in Capricorn, still every fall is a kind of exaltation, and there is a peak of psychic understanding in Capricorn related to the Ajna center, often ruled by Venus, but of which Neptune is the higher octave. So you will find an exaltation, as it were, of the form aspect and the psychic nature, a reverse exaltation in Capricorn. So they reach these, the form aspect and the psychic nature, reach an eventual concrete perfection in Capricorn, to become again in Cancer the perfect instrument of service which the initiate wields. The perfect instrument of service which the initiate wields as he seeks to render mass service instead of being involved and lost in the mass. So he returns, the initiate returns to the mass. Okay, so the initiate returns to the mass with what he has achieved in Capricorn. It almost seems like this is something that we could consider the Dalai Lama having done. He has a Cancerian incarnation, but he's obviously an initiate. And the perfect instrument of service which can reach the mass is wielded. And as I said, the initiate becomes the crab who cleans the ocean of matter which flows around the soul of men, or as it clears the ocean of matter which flows around the soul of men. The crab, soul's matter, the crab matter. Let's see if we can get that. Creative hierarchy, here it is. The crab which clears the ocean of matter which flows around the soul of man. That's what it is. From page 62 of Esoteric Psychology, Esoteric Astrology 2. So, something is perfected in Capricorn and utilized in the valleys with the mass in Capricorn. You almost wonder, there is a descent from the mountain, lost am I in light supernal, yet on that light I turn my back. But you wonder whether a Capricorn incarnation could not be followed by a Cancerian incarnation, or whether an initiate with the sun in Capricorn might not have Cancer as the rising sign to be developed after initiation was taken. So this concrete perfection is preserved and is used as an instrument of service in the attempt to reach the mass, not with the entirety of what was understood on the mountaintop, but with enough so that the mass can understand. Moses had to come down from the mountaintop as well, and it's my impression that in addition to the Aries sign, which is reputed to be his, along with Muhammad, that there was a Cancerian aspect, a Capricornian aspect to the lawgiver, to Moses. The power of Saturn in this sign furthers the ends and purposes of the governing energies of the rays of harmony through conflict. Rays of harmony through conflicts, the Moon and Mercury, and of Neptune. Now, there is power there, and that's interesting. There is not necessarily a weakening of the influence of Saturn, even though there is a detriment here. There is harmony through conflict, and Saturn adds to the conflict. And Neptune, well, it's more a planet of harmony. For in this sign, Saturn is in the home of its detriment, and thus produces those difficult conditions and situations which will lead to the needed struggle. This is something which people with Saturn, who have Saturn in relation to Cancer, really have to remember, that it's not just the penalties of incarnation they may be paying, but a needed struggle is produced perhaps between the direction taken by the elemental life and that which the soul attempts to impose from above as an aspect of the divine plan for the person. The spiritual will is delivered through Saturn, among other planets, maybe also Vulcan, even Uranus to an extent. So the difficult situations within the elemental nature within the vehicles are produced, and one tries to struggle against the lower tendencies to establish that which should, according to Saturn, be established. So what's interesting here is simply because a planet is in detriment does not mean that it is not powerful. I'm going to emphasize that word power. The power of Saturn in this sign furthers the ends and purposes of the governing energies or rays of harmony through various conflicts, the Moon and Mercury, and of Neptune. The end of Neptune would be to further the growth of the Christ energy. Neptune is Vishnu, is the Christ, is the transcendent one, the one who offers, especially at the first two initiations, the energy impacts which lead one beyond captivity to the form, or at least the process is begun. This makes Cancer a place of symbolic imprisonment and emphasizes the pains and penalties of wrong orientation. I've seen this in action. The orientation, if it is wrong, incorrect, is an orientation towards the strengthening of matter form against the refinement that the soul would see occur. So a person is held within a struggle with Saturn impelling towards liberation through discipline, and a certain aspect of Cancer seeking to hold the individual where he or she may be. So in this confined place, and Saturn contributes to that confinement, says you shall not move out of this place until you succeed in the right way within that struggle. In this confined place, the consciousness and the life activity of the individual is imprisoned. And because of this imprisonment and some of the repetitive actions which have to occur in order to lead to increasing liberation, there is pain. And there is felt to be a penalty even in sports. Sometimes you're taken off the field and you cannot play for a while. You have to sit out the action. And the good effect of your services will not be benefiting your team during that time. It is the conflict of the soul with its environment. The environment is so much Cancerian, and that which engirths and circumscribes is Jupiter. Jupiter surrounds, and Saturn represents circumstances and their limitations. So it is the conflict of the soul with its environment, consciously or unconsciously carried on, and very often unconsciously carried on. People simply complain about the limitation of their scope during such periods, where you kind of think about parenthood. Maybe, well, these days more parenthood, in the old days more motherhood, let us say, where the mother is confined to a small space, carrying on the duty, Saturn, of taking care of the new lives in form. And this, of course, leads to a sacrifice. Well, just think about Sanat Kumara, how in a way he is the great parent and is confined to a space, a small space, where he has to look after those who are far below him in their development and who are human beings in form seeking to evolve. So there always is a higher analogy. It is the conflict of the soul with its environment, consciously or unconsciously carried on, which leads to the penalties of incarnation, and which provides those conditions of suffering which the soul has willingly undertaken, though the personality may not remember it, when with open eyes and clear vision the soul chose the path of earth life with all its consequent sacrifices and pains in order to salvage the lives with which it had an affinity. The forgetfulness of the personality, I think, personality consciousness leads to impatience under such symbolically imprisoning circumstances. So this is one of those very good descriptions of a planet in a sign from the esoteric perspective. Symbolic imprisonment, emphasizing the pains and penalties of wrong orientation, probably from the past, and these orientations have to be corrected, dutifully corrected, and that brings in the Saturnine element of duty. It is the conflict of the soul, whichever works for the fulfillment of responsibility. When we feel responsibility, a just type of responsibility, it is a soul impulse. So the desires of the individual want to break free of this Cancerian ring pasanat, this Cancerian imprisonment, but the soul, utilizing Saturn, holds the personality to its redemptive duty, and until the situation is mastered and the desires no longer are carrying one towards that which is lower than what the soul intends. So it is the conflict of the soul with its environment, consciously or unconsciously carried on, which leads to the penalties of incarnation. and which provide, maybe all incarnations have their penalties, but when the personality deviates too much, the karmic corrective comes in. Saturn is the planet of karma, correcting within our vehicles tendencies which lead away from those the soul intends, which leads to the penalties of incarnation and which provides those conditions of suffering, that is the unfulfillment of desire, of lower desire, which the soul is willingly undertaken, but the soul is also willing to confine itself to a circumscribed space in order for redemption to occur. When, with open eyes and clear vision before incarnation, the soul, that is the consciousness within the ego on the higher mental plane, chose the path of earth life with all its consequent sacrifices and pains. And this occurs not only before every incarnation, but in a sense before the entire series of incarnations, as the soul visualizes that which lies ahead. Although you wonder how much consciousness per se there can be within the causal body of those early times. Certainly there is the redemptive consciousness of the monad that has a very full view of the entire pilgrimage which is to be undertaken. So when with open eyes and clear vision the soul chose the path of earth life with all its consequent sacrifices and pains in order to salvage the lives with which it had an affinity. Not necessarily all lives, right? But certain ones with which it has an affinity. It is not for the limited unit to attempt to do all things. Now, we seem to be reaching the place of discussing the decanates. It says, curiously, it is Sepharial who places the rulers of the decanates more accurately than does Leo. Of course, you can wonder whether there really is placement here or whether there is simply the application of the Chaldean system based upon distinctive planetary periods as understood from the geocentric point of view. Usually this is reversed, and Alan Leo is the more correct of the two astrologers. Neither is as correct as the Tibetan. Sepharial gives us Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, and you see these in descending order of periods from the geocentric perspective. Sepharial gives us Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, whereas Leo apportions in the Hindu system the Moon, ruler of Cancer sub Cancer, Mars, ruler of Cancer sub Scorpio, and Jupiter, ruler of Cancer sub Pisces. And there is something to that. These rulerships do actually work out, maybe not so much from the esoteric point of view, but when you look at the average human being, you do see these influences. Although we notice that the Moon is reversed, and is the only planet that is shared in common in the two systems. And in the case of Sepharial, it's in the third decanate, and in the case of Alan Leo, it's in the first. We have sometimes discussed whether we should reverse the Sepharial decanates according to the Tibetan statement that the average man enters the sign from 30 degrees to 20, then 20 to 10. But Sepharial was not thinking in those terms at all, nor was the Chaldean system. When we deal with Venus, Mercury, Moon, we're dealing with 0 to 10 Venus, 10 to 20 Mercury, which would be the same in both cases, and 20 to 30 the Moon. Let's see here. Going down here to Cancer in this constellations and zodiacal constellations, decanate rulers, we do see, as we descend, Taurus, 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 Cancer. Okay, here is Cancer. And here are the Sepharial decanates of Venus, Mercury, and the Moon in that order. Here are the Alan Leo decanates, Moon, Mars, and Jupiter, or perhaps Neptune, as Alan Leo did emphasize the Neptune connection to Pisces, and we are dealing with the Pisces decanate. I mean, even though we have diverse planetary rulers, I think we cannot avoid the implication that the first 10 degrees is Cancer, Cancer. The second 10 degrees Cancer, Scorpio. The third 10 degrees Cancer, Pisces, as we see over here in the appropriate colors. So on the wheel of consciousness, according to the Tibetan, we take Sepharial's planetary rulers. The extra-zodiacal decanates are Argo, the ship, or also Shes and Fent, the great ox, enclosed. It's the enclosure that's important. It's also all of the personality powers on their way together in integrated cooperation towards some objective, and this is led by Jason, the captain or the leader of the Argonauts. And Venus will be the planet correlated with that, but we can wonder whether this really will hold. Whether there is a good connection with Venus and Argo. There certainly can be considered a connection with the Moon and Argo, because the Moon represents the vessel, the personality vehicles containing all of their various powers and different capacities. We move to the Ursa Minor in the second decanate, and that has a Mercury rulership. I think Mercury is correct. We deal here with the little bear and possibly with the Agnes center when considered from the perspective of the one about whom naught may be said. Certain of these great constellations do provide chakric localities in that great being, and I think it is legitimate to think of Ursa Minor in relation to the little bear, and at a certain point we know that Mercury is associated with the Agnes center, just as the little bear can be associated in the one about whom naught may be said. It's the lesser sheepfold, and it's the lesser ashram from a certain perspective, meaning not the great ashram of hierarchy, but the subsidiary ashrams, subsidiary ray ashrams. The idea of enclosure is always found here. As a matter of fact, you think of the entire universe, the great egg of the universe, as a Cancerian structure. The third decanate has attributed to it the extra-zodiacal association of Ursa Major, which is the greater sheepfold and the great bear, more the power of the first ray, and of the greater ashram of hierarchy, and possibly even the influence of Shambhala. Now here, the Moon is found in the Sepharial decanates. It would make more sense, in a sense, for Jupiter to be found, because it is the greater sheepfold, and the Mars assignment by Alan Leo, which is simply the Hindu assignment, makes sense as well, because Mars has to do with the aspiration of the lesser workers of hierarchy, just as Mars can be associated somewhat with Procyon in Gemini. We'll see that when we get into the next chapter. But this Moon must veil a planet, and I suppose one can consider it as veiling Vulcan. Vulcan is associated with the 7 head centers of man, the will centers within the head, or perhaps above the head, or perhaps both. And interestingly enough, the great bear per se is associated with the 7 head centers of the one about whom naught may be said. So there is a parallel here between Vulcan and the great bear. And I suppose the Pisces correlation can come in with Ursa Major and the greater ashram as being a saving ashram, the great ashram of hierarchy, and also Shambhala as well, where the highest example of world saviorship is found. So there's nothing completely settled about these planetary rulerships, or especially about the extra-zodiacal associations, constellations associated. In a way, all of them tell us something about every Cancerian subject, and all of the extra-zodiacal constellations associated with any sign tell us something about that subject, regardless of what decanate he may be born in. We have to study human nature very closely, as the Tibetan has, to arrive at these conclusions. And sometimes, rather than simply have one planet be associated with the decanate, it is justifiable to have more associated, because they show us some additional factors. I mean, the great bear, the greater sheepfold, hierarchy, and Jupiter certainly makes sense. And, of course, Jupiter is the ruler of Pisces. That's why it's there in the Leo configuration. And the little sheepfold of those who are still aspiring, let us say, Mars, still transmuting, still elevating the energies toward hierarchy, that makes sense as well. But I've also spoken of the way that Venus, bringing integration and the orientation towards the soul, and Mercury having to do with the ajna center focus and growing intuition, and the moon having to do with spiritual will as it veils Vulcan, also makes sense. With the Argo, the ship, or the great ox enclosed, the little bear or lesser sheepfold, and the greater bear or greater sheepfold. All of these do make sense. So we want to use our reason at all times. And if we are incorrect in using our reason, it will be demonstrated to us why we are incorrect. Meanwhile, we should go by the light of reason, which eventually will turn into pure reason. Okay, so we see the other chart has shown us the different possible decanate rulers, and the one that the Tibetan prefers. The reason he prefers it, the mind, the uses of conflict, and form life are the contributing factors leading the soul along the way of incarnation. When he talks about the way of incarnation, this is curious, because he seems to indicate, by the way of incarnation, possibly the clockwise wheel. We have to think about that. Now he says the instrument of release is, in the last analysis, the right use and control of the organ of illumination, which is the mind. But this again correlates with Venus, does it not? So often when DK talks about the mind, he does, or the intellect, he does actually mention Venus. Very different type of emphasis, a more fifth-ray emphasis than is common when we understand Venus from the perspective of ordinary astrology. So the way of illumination, we have to see whether he means us to consider that Venus is the ruler of the first decanate, Mercury of the second, and Moon the ruler of the third. Because the way of incarnation can be the way of the clockwise wheel, or it can be both directions. So let us see. The instrument of release is, in the last analysis, the right use and control of the organ of illumination, which is in the mind. And this can involve both Venus and Mercury. Hence the necessary emphasis ever laid upon meditation when the aspirant awakens to spiritual opportunity. So once we begin to realize what the possible goal is, meditation, which is controlled very much by Venus, although you would wonder why Mercury cannot be involved in it, since when you look at the astrological correlates to meditation, concentration is ruled by Leo, and Virgo rules meditation, with its ruler and exalted planet Mercury. Anyway, we have to achieve illumination. Now, we also have to develop strength, which comes through conflict and constant struggle. And this, so often when he discusses Mercury, he means struggle and conflict. Mercury is sometimes called, interestingly enough, the star of conflict. Maybe we can see this. If we look here. Mercury, star, conflict. Then we look it up and we see Mercury, the star of conflict. This is page 357. Is also the major planet of relationships. Conflict and relationships seemingly inseparable, but Mercury, the star of conflict. Conflict and constant struggle build up steadily that reserve of strength and power, which enables the aspirant to take the final tests of discipleship in Scorpio. Now, we might ask, look at Alan Leo's rulership of the Moon, Mars, and Jupiter. Why should not Mars be involved here as well in constant conflict? Could it be considered so? Should Mars be involved as well? In the process of conflict and constant struggle. But anyway, it builds up strength, the reserve of strength and power, which enables the aspirant to take the final test in Scorpio, of discipleship in Scorpio, and to brave in Capricorn the trials of initiation. Notice tests and trials, how he associates trials with Capricorn and tests with Scorpio. But Mars is also involved in both. And I think when you look at people who are born in the Scorpio decade of Cancer, you do see the Mars influence. Certainly you see the Scorpio influence in their physiognomy. That book by David Andreas, I wish I remembered the title of the book, but it shows the facial characteristics of the people born in the different decanates, and it hints at their character as well. And the breaking of bonds, the trials of initiation and the breakings of bonds, which the process of incarnation have forged. Now this is Vulcanian language. Definitely. Vulcanian language. And so hinting that that the moon, veiling Vulcan, rules in the third decan. So he did not really give us a reason to reverse the Venus-Mercury moon. I suppose what we would say is that the average person comes in under the moon from 30 to 20, experiences Mercury, and finally Venus, and then reverses the direction for the to achieve the counterclockwise direction, and then we have Venus, Mercury, Moon. But we cannot forget about the Moon, Mars, Jupiter as possibilities. The breaking of bonds is a freeing aspect, as is found in Pisces, but I think it is the Moon veiling Vulcan. Now, let's see if we can find this from Stephen. He usually has quite accurate ideas. And yes, his perspective is the inner wheel. The inner wheel for him is I think the reversed wheel. And he does seem to reverse this somewhat. He seems to begin with Venus at 30 degrees, going backwards in a clockwise manner to the moon, and then the moon, Mercury, and Venus, instead of Venus, Mercury, and the moon. Perhaps not giving attention to the possibility that Vulcan is being veiled by the moon. Let's see what Nicholas gives us here. He looks at it more from Venus, Mercury, Moon, and Moon, Mars, Jupiter. He gives the Alan Leo connection. But of course, again, Alan Leo meant very definitely that the moon would relate to 0 to 10, Mars 10 to 20, and Jupiter 20 to 30. So again, there is a deviation, I think, from what Alan Leo actually meant, but Nicholas chooses to use the Alan Leo decanates, at least in some manner. Okay. Now let's see further. We'll come to the word later. Right now, we will continue the discussion of the decanates, and we'll turn to this other chart that I have, the sixfold comparison. And I wonder if I can make this any bigger in this way. No, that is not going to work. We'll do it this way. Okay. Yes, we'll do it this way. So we have here the three decanates: Cancer, 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 Scorpio, Cancer, Pisces. And it says here that there is some ambiguity in the way DK phrases the rulerships. Either Venus or the moon could be the final decanate, and we must decide which way to operate. Going back to what DK says, he seems to begin with the idea of the way of incarnation, meaning, let's see, how does he do this? Yes, the way of incarnation. He talks about the mind, the uses of conflict, and form life, as if the mind was perhaps being used in the last decanate and form life in the form life from 0 to 10, going backwards. But then he seems to repeat himself with respect to the clockwise wheel, and the organ of illumination is definitely the mind. the way of release is, the organ is definitely the mind, the organ of illumination, and it's not the moon. Conflict is, in fact, Mercury in this case, and with a little bit of Mars thrown in, as we see when we use the Alan Leo decanate, building up strength and reserves, kind of a Martian thing. So he hints at that. And power being built up, which enables the disciple to take the final tests of discipleship in Scorpio. There's kind of a hint there when we talk about strength and power. Vulcan may be involved. How about spelling, huh? And the trials of Capricorn, and then the breaking of all bonds. Well, the forging of bonds is very much a lunar thing in which Vulcan acts in a material way. But Vulcan is involved in the breaking of bonds as well, and I don't see that that should be correlated with Venus. I think that is a final moon Vulcan kind of indication. So I think I would go with the idea that we move from the moon, Mercury, to Venus, and Venus, Mercury, and the moon. But along with it, we would add the possibility of Mars, adding possibility of Mars from Alan Leo, and adding the possibility here of Jupiter, and adding the possibility of the moon from Alan Leo. Nevertheless, the Tibetan says Sepharial is the more correct. So this is the been called the first decanate is the decanate of personal summation, reversal, and reorientation. I think we should keep those in mind. I have not always said that, but it is, I think, good to keep that in mind. Then the second decanate on the reverse wheel, the decanate of soul unfoldment, where we have the probationary initiate as a possibility. And finally, the decanate of spiritual consummation and release. Now remember, people can be at any stage of the path. This is my assumption, at any stage of the path, and be born in or under any of the decanates. The Alan Leo decanates we see here, the moon, Mars, the uses of conflict, whether Mars is involved in Mercury, and also Jupiter in the last decanate, which brings release. Now we have three sets of rulers in Cancer. When thinking of human progress, three sets of rulers, orthodox, esoteric, and hierarchical, have to be combined with the decanate rulers and significant constellations. The following composite picture also takes into account Alan Leo's rulerships, which are related to the zodiacal subcategories. These do exist, namely Cancer as the first subcategory of the first decanate, Scorpio as the second subcategory pertaining to the second decanate, and Pisces as the third subcategory pertaining to the third decanate. And it looks like I have a little bit of work to do. I've done these over different time periods, and it looks like they all have to be made more or less equivalent. The influence of the sign itself and the rays coming through the sign are always present. The influence of the extra zodiacal constellations should be included. Okay, so now we will look at the specific periods. The first period is the physical period. It is ruled by the moon. It's specifically the period of the developments that are occurring when the first petal of the egoic lotus is under unfoldment. We say of it that the blind unit is lost. And I think if we turn here to Esoteric Astrology, page 332, we call it the mass, a low form of mass consciousness, which is largely instinctual. This we already discussed a little earlier in the Cancerian chapter. The direction here will be from the moon to Mercury to Venus. The body is the main focus. This is ruled by the moon primarily because we're going in the reverse order. The proper order for the developing person is Venus, Mercury, Moon, but now we're going Moon, Mercury, Venus. So the body is gradually becoming sensitized to the impacts from the surroundings, its purely instinctual life in the first decanate. In the second decanate, the physical body is learning adaptation through incipient mind, which is Mercury. The survival struggles under Mars and Mercury in which the physical body is engaged, if we include Alan Leo's Mars. Okay. Then when we move into, we're still very much in the physical instinctual life, and we move into the third decanate on the clockwise wheel, we are finding that in general, of course, the moon is dominating, but there is confinement within the lunar vehicle. The moon dominates in all these places. Can we actually, can Venus be used here to indicate this low stage? Well, man is coming to himself, and a point of consciousness is being formed. Consciousness is gradually forming. Okay. So Venus represents that spark of mind, which focuses in the physical brain and on the mental plane as well, first, and gradually creates a reflective center of consciousness within the physical brain, and so awareness would be growing, awareness of one's own identity, probably the, let's call it incipient ego, or simply awareness of the lower self, the lower ego, the self-sense, which at first is usually centered around the physical body. All right, these are some things I'm adding as we go. One always thinks perhaps of more things. So that's the physical stage, and it involves the unfoldment of the first petal of the egoic lotus. When we begin to move into the emotional phase, that is largely the focused in the unfoldment of the second petal. Notice I'm moving in the clockwise manner here when discussing these early phases. The moon is the ruler of Neptune, and Neptune is still veiled in this psychic emotional stage. The moon is the orthodox ruler. The blind unit is still lost, but the unit begins to be sensitive through emotion to that which is around. So we might have, let's just say, some incipient Neptunian consciousness emerging. So we would go over here because they're coming in via the 30-degree area. The moon is dominating. I'm not sure whether we really should use Venus here. I'm becoming quite convinced, actually, that although some have directed Venus as the final decanate, and therefore as the starting decanate, I do believe the moon is much, much better. So I'm going to cross off Venus here. It gives me a clearer sense of what's going on. The moon is dominating here, and it is the lunar, it is the lunar phase, and we're coming in via that phase, increasing receptivity to the emotional nature, expanding emotional sensitivity. More so than the emotions associated with the instincts in the strictly physical phase. And the contacts, number of contacts are growing. Contacts about which one feels are growing. And the reason I said that, because we might involve Jupiter here from the Alan Leo perspective. It is, after all, the sensitive, sentient Pisces decanate. See, we can say something about the decanates on the basis of the subsign rulership. So, you know, as it says in relation to Pisces, it's rather material mantram, go forth into matter. Go forth into the matter of the emotions. Go forth into emotional matter. Experience a wider range of contacts. The moon is still dominating, of course, although, let's just say, its veil of Neptune is steadily lessening. This is the Mercury decanate. Now, constant change and conflict in the emotional nature. What does one really want? What does one desire? What is one afraid of? What is one trying to avoid? And possible additional conflicts here with the sub-association of Mars as the ruler of the Scorpio phase of Cancer. I know that in some of these earlier signs I did not go through with any care the very early phases. I pretty much dealt with the mental phase and the reversal towards the summation of the personal phase. But here I am doing that, and one, I suppose, on the basis of what has been said can gather the influences and figure these things out. Okay, then we reach the Venus phase. The instinctual emotional response is still there. One is a prisoner of the emotional body, but let us say that Venus has an effect, so that the Camomanus can be sensed, because the monastic aspect of Venus can be somewhat felt. So Venus is always the intellect, or it is that center within the mental body which is associated with selfhood. And Camomanus is a blend of mind and emotions, and Venus is much associated with the mind, so there continues to be instinctual emotional response. But perhaps one is the prisoner of the emotional body, let's just say, though, but greater light comes into the emotional body from Venus. All right. Now I think we have reached the stage when I can say that this is the end of Esoteric Astrology 100A, and we are in this chart. We're still not completing the book quite. We're still on page 343, as it were. Still on page 343, and beginning of EAA 100B and the sixfold chart.